Good morning, everybody, or I guess almost afternoon. We're gonna start in a few minutes. Ulil, I'll stop sharing this if you wanted to set up if you were going to use any AV.
Okay. Can you guys see the slides now?
Yep.
Okay.
And so we are recording.
Oh, awesome. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming today. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Welcome, welcome, everybody. As you come in, thanks for being here. We'll start in just a minute. Father Clancy, good to see you.
Hi, Father Tim.
Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. I like to run a tight ship here, and so we're going to get started right at noon, and people will file in as they do. I am very happy to join you all today for our most recent installment of our Environmental Studies lecture series. This is an ongoing series of talks that we are very happy to host. And with us today, we have Dr. Ulil Amri, our postdoc teaching fellow, is going to present some of his research. Dr. Amri, in 2005, got his Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from Gajah Mada University in Indonesia. And then in 2009, he received his Master's of Applied Anthropology from the Australian National University in Canberra. In 2015, he received the Master's of Arts in Anthropology and from the University of Washington here in Washington State. And then in 2019, just last year, he became Dr. Amri, defending his dissertation, which was entitled "Of Mysterious Whispers and Biodiesel, the Entanglement of Religion and Everyday Environmental Practices in Indonesia." It's my very happy pleasure to have everybody welcome Dr. Amri. We can do a little clap reaction there at the bottom in your Zoom. So I'll take it away, Dr. Amri.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brian Henning. So the title of this lecture is like what you are seeing right now, ReThinking, Conservation in New Materialist Ecology. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the first people of Spokane. I also acknowledge that the tribal government and their role today in taking care of this land. Again, I would like to thank Dr. Brian Henning for giving me this wonderful opportunity to share my thoughts on contemporary research or theories and practice in environmentalism or conservation. Also, I would like to thank Dr. John Isakoff and Dr. Judy Westcott, my mentor here at Gonzaga. And also, I would like to thank all colleagues in the Environmental Studies Department for their wonderful support so far. I should also thank Dr. Jessica Moccioni, Dr. Ann Ostendorf, and Dr. Sarah Diaz, and the postdoctoral teaching fellowship program that has provided me with this amazing opportunity to be here at this amazing university, Gonzaga. This is the work that I am doing right now. I'm focusing right now, and I'm gonna develop more in the future. And I'm really interested in bridging the gap between theory and practice in natural resource management, if you will. And so today I'm going to give a more like traditional way of giving lecture. I'm going to read my paper, and at the same time I'm going to share some slides for you guys to just help you and me too to better understand what I'm reading in my paper. Okay. This is the picture of Whanganui River in New Zealand. In 2017, the government of New Zealand, people of New Zealand, to the New Zealanders, they have granted legal rights to this river, meaning that this river is now seen or treated as, active entity. Sometimes people acknowledge this river as person because they said that they have legal personhood. This is a statement from Adrian Rurahe, a member of parliament and also a Maori. He says that from Whanganui viewpoint, the well-being of the river is directly linked to the well-being of the people. 3 or 4 years before, New Zealanders also granted legal rights to this Te Urewera. It's actually a land, lake, forest area at the same time. And this is Te Urewera Act. It says Te Urewera has an identity in and on itself. All the rights, powers, duties, and liabilities of a legal person. So in Maori kind of traditional way of life or perspective, they see nature has an agency. Nature has mana or authority. And at the same time, they also see nature has life force. They call it as Maori. So there is no separation between nature and humanity. They see all living beings, human beings, natural entities, the inanimates have agencies as well. And in 2008, in Ecuador, I believe some of us have already known that Ecuadorian people, the government, also the citizens, enacted their new constitution and adopts the rights of nature. For example, in the Article 71, it mentions the Ecuadorian government will promote respect towards all the elements that form an ecosystem. Nature changed from being held as property to a rights-bearing entity. An incredible historic and revolutionary events have taken place. It is nice to see how various parties, locals, villagers, activists, government officials, politicians, judges collaborate and decide to acknowledge the constitutional rights or legal rights of non-human entities. These decisions will significantly affect the future of natural resource management, as well as our future interaction with nature and our conservation practices. These decisions do not happen overnight. certain socio-material conditions must be in place if these policy changes are to be successful. But why are these revolutionary policies only implemented in New Zealand and Ecuador, not in other places? Well, there are some initiatives here in the States, for example, in Ulil County in Pennsylvania that granted or that enacted like municipal ordinance for nature, but it didn't acknowledge specific entity that was granted. Perhaps the answer lies in the strong influence of local ecological knowledge, or what we know as traditional ecological knowledge. There are so many definitions of traditional ecological knowledge. I got this from Berkes. He's a applied ecologist at the University of Manitoba. He says that the term traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, is used to describe the knowledge held by indigenous cultures about their immediate environment and the cultural practices that build on that knowledge. Traditional ecological knowledge includes an intimate and detailed knowledge of plants, animals, and natural phenomena, the development and use of appropriate technologies for hunting, fishing, trapping, agriculture, and forestry, and a holistic knowledge or worldview which parallels the scientific discipline of ecology. Culture and spirituality provide New Zealanders and Ecuadorians with a strong conservationist foundation and inspire them to protect their natural resources. New Zealanders believe that rivers and mountains are life sources and that these natural entities have spiritual values. This view has inspired various parties to grant legal rights to these non-human forms of life. The Maori especially see the rivers, the lakes, the mountains as their ancestors, their companions, and their homes. Ecuadorian people see nature as their mother, so they call it Pachamama, or Mother Earth. There have been some efforts to employ traditional ecological knowledge in other countries, like in India and the US, in other places too. Recently, activists, scholars, and communities in Toledo, Ohio, tried to grant legal rights to Lake Erie. So this is the picture of Lake Erie. It's so polluted by algae blooms. Some people said that it was because of the agricultural farmings surrounding the lake. So one of the grassroots activists, for example, says that there are many different effects. We have four. One is education, that you open people's eyes to this possibility, and also to give notice to those doing the environmental harm, that we are not going to tolerate this anymore. Three is the hope that other people will follow you on the path you have started to clear. So these activist actions led to a vote to establish Bill of Rights for the lake. They were successful for about several months. It was March last year. But then Ohio's Chamber of Commerce killed the bill in August last year. So it was only successful for 5 months, I guess. Similarly, in India, citizens drew up a petition to grant legal rights to the Ganges and Yamuna rivers. So this is the picture of Yamuna rivers. And one of the grassroots lawyers in India says that the bill, the initiative will help protect the rivers, as they now have all the constitutional and statutory rights of human beings, including the right to life. But the effort was blocked by the country's highest court. Opponents of such bills argued that non-human entities like Lake Erie and Ganges are not living entities and have no interest, thus making it impossible to grant these entities legal rights. According to lawmakers, legal protection can only be given to human subjects that have political interest. These officials argue that forms of nature, be it river, lake, or forest, do not have such interest. So there is no need to protect them or grant them legal rights. This is ironic, unjust, and undemocratic. We have seen legal or personal rights granted to corporations, but not to nature. In the US, since the 14th Amendment was ratified, corporations have enjoyed legal rights of personhood. Similarly, in India and other countries, corporations corporations are acknowledged as legal entities endowed with a juridical personality. Why shouldn't we give legal rights to non-human natural entities like forests, lakes, and rivers? To better understand this complex issue, we can get a more maybe radical perspective, for example, by drawing upon the theories of new materialism. This is one of the influential books on new materialisms. There are some other books actually. There are some definition of new materialism, but this is the one that I think quite helpful for us to refer to. So it says that new materialism is an interdisciplinary, theoretically and politically committed field of inquiry. It foregrounds novel accounts of matter's agentic thrust, processual nature, formative impetus, and self-organizing capacities, whereby matter, as seen as active force, is not only sculpted by but also a productive in conditioning and enabling social world and expression, human life and experience. I can't remember the other side of the slide. And then the question is, what is the difference between old materialism and new materialism? From old materialism point of view, matter is seen as static, passive entity, and do not have agency. Whereas in new materialism, matter is seen as dynamic, active, and have agency. Agency means capacity to act. So it is like the way we see, nature, like few years ago, decades ago, or few times ago, we tend to see our humanity is the only entity that has, full control of other things, including nature. That is an old materialistic kind of perspective. But today, because we have experienced some, things, disasters, natural catastrophes, then we, gradually change our mind. And this is also what new materialist scholars think, that the disasters are actually the way that nature or non-human entities show their powers, their agencies that affect our life, our humanity. Climate change, COVID-19 right now, we can see how powerful the viruses are in shaping, changing, affecting our daily lives. New materialism is an intellectual framework that values and acknowledges the agency of certain non-human entities. New materialism provides theoretical foundations and concrete strategies to help us understand and acknowledge the rights of non-human natural resources. New materialist perspectives, I argue, will help transform contemporary natural resource management and conservation practices into more progressive and democratic ecological activities. Therefore, I would like to discuss this new framework or perspective, which I call New Materialist Ecology, and its potential contribution to contemporary and future conservation practices. I will again ask the question, why has there been a failure to officially recognize the legal rights of non-human natural entities on a global scale? Since 1972, legal scholar Christopher Stone Chris Stone has been a proponent of the idea that we need to give, to provide, to grant legal rights to natural objects. Stone critiqued some initiatives that advocate nature's rights and focused on the benefits of these rights for the whole humanity. Even conservationists, said Stone, do their work for the greatest good of humanity. So he recommended that we need to give or grant natural objects legal rights and officially recognize them as persons who have interest in growing, acting, and developing. Although this idea was revolutionary in early 1970s, think of it as the embryonic stage of new materialism today, it still did not have a revolutionary effect of convincing people to view natural resources as subjects, let alone acknowledge their legal rights. Why? I think the answer is that Stone's notion of providing legal rights or granting legal rights or giving legal rights to nature is not powerful enough. His argument still sees nature as passive and static. So people were not convinced that non-human natural entities had interest, had agency, and more importantly, had power. I salute Stone's effort in acknowledging the importance of granting legal rights to nature, but I disagree with him and those who argue that the non-human entities are objects. Some thinkers, philosophers, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and even biologists have recently problematized the objectification of non-human entities. Science historian Donna Haraway invites us to see our humanity as essentially cyborgs, a combination of human and non-human traits. Cultural historian Thomas Berry reminded us about the rights of non-human entities like trees, insects, and rivers, and invited us to see our world as communion of subjects instead of collection of objects. French sociologist Bruno Latour popularizes the term network to show that both humans and non-humans are important to the making of social order. Rosalind Lapierre, a prominent scholar of the Blackfeet indigenous tribe, commented that a river is more than a person, more powerful than a person, bigger than a person. It is a sacred entity. British anthropologist Tim Ingold promotes his notion of meshwork, which proposes that non-human entities are in fact just as alive as human beings. Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro uses the term multinaturalism, which means different species have different experiences in the world. Political scientist Jen Bennett of Johns Hopkins University wrote an influential book titled Vibrant Matter, in which she extols the agency of non-human inanimate objects like rocks, stones, images, photographs, books, anything in the making of social life. Even a long time ago, German biologist Jacob von Uexküll introduced the idea of Umwelt, which argues that animals and plants are subjective entities. They have subjectivities. They have senses like we are human beings. These new materialist scholars do not see non-humans as persons or objects, but rather as subjects or entities with agency. They try to avoid anthropomorphism or personification of non-humans, which may potentially denigrate and devalue their existence. Rather, the scholars acknowledgement is an important word here. These scholars acknowledge the agency of these non-humans and attribute to them their own uniqueness, subjectivities, aspirations, powers, and of course, interests. The interest of these non-human entities lies in their aspiration to grow and live alongside us, not just in their ability to passively affect us. Take the Spoken River, for example. Some of us have used the river's power to generate electricity. Some have enjoyed fishing and taking part in other recreational activities in the river. Others have dumped waste in the river. We mostly think about how the river affects us, or specifically how it pleases us or fulfills our needs and desires. However, we have never considered what these entities need from us, their interest in flowing, interacting with us, and in becoming something else in the future. I remember Twale Abrahamson Swan, a member of Spoken Tribe, who is also a restorative ecologist. She mentioned that Spoken Tribe members had lost their interaction with the river. I continue. These new materialist scholars help us not only to think about non-human entities like the Spoken River, but also to more accurately feel their presence as well as their aspirations and interests. Furthermore, the new materialist scholars also invite us to leave off relationships as usual and build a new and meaningful relationship with the non-humans in which we acknowledge the full extent of their existence. And this new relationship requires us to avoid seeing ourselves, humanity, as the only active entities, agents, or subjects in this social world. Some of these new materialist scholars even push for the inclusion of these non-human entities in the political processes. They urge us to allow the involvement of these entities as the new demos or new participants in the democratic process. For these scholars, all entities, including non-humans, within this democratic system must be counted as part of the collective social will, regardless of their socio-historical backgrounds. The active engagement of non-human participants in the democratic system pushes us to reconstruct the constitution of not only law, but also life. The new materialist scholars then challenge us to redefine and reconceptualize the meaning of democracy and politics. Here I argue that the way new materialism redefines and reconceptualizes the meaning of democracy and politics by engaging non-human entities as living organisms with officially recognized rights is an innovative reincarnation of traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, that I have mentioned before. From an indigenous perspective, as we know, the role of non-human entities is vital, as we see with Yakima, Sioux tribe, Blackfeet tribes, spoken tribes too in the United States, the Maori tribe in New Zealand, and the Amungme tribe, Komoro tribe in Indonesia. Humans often need non-humans as allies to solve daily problems regarding the economy, ecology, and politics. For example, how to grow food, how to protect the food, and how to protect themselves from invasion. Unfortunately, our anthropocentric modernity often denigrates such indigenous or otherwise traditional epistemology. New materialism, therefore, on the one hand, pushes traditional ecological knowledge to achieve its revolutionary potential, and on the other, attempts to challenge or problematize this negative legacy of modernity or anthropocentrism. This is a project, anthropocentrism, the negative legacy of modernity, a project that started around the 17th century and was promoted by rational and empirical scholars who position humans as distinctive entities, separate from others, including nature. This viewpoint from early modernity is still prevalent today, especially with the emergence of the rampant neoliberalism since 1950s. This neoliberal anthropocentric modernity sees everything as a commodity. Pope Francis has voiced concern and criticism on this topic. His Laudato Si and the recent Fratelli Tutti, just released like a week ago, critique this contemporary neoliberal ideology. And I think this is getting powerful today because before he released, Fratelli Tutti, he had a meeting with other faith leaders as well. Commodification of everything, humans and non-humans, has been continuously happening almost uninterrupted through the centuries with no end in sight. However, I should mention here that we cannot simplify or essentialize neoliberal modernity. We have witnessed the emergence of market-based conservation, including carbon credits, cap and trade, kind of mechanism, ecosystem services, carbon trade-offs, and market innovation, so many of them. And these mechanisms aims to deviate from business as usual and show a more ethical face of neoliberalism. Unfortunately, there have been no comprehensive studies on whether this market-based conservation mechanism have been fully implemented or how effective they are. We may need more time to monitor the results. In addition, this market initiative tends to perpetuate technical and instrumental legacies of anthropocentric modernity in dealing with ecological problems. Technological advance must continue to solve problems. So this is a kind of belief in our modern world today, that we tend to believe that all ecological problems can be, solved by new technologies, and some people, prefer to use more technologies to deal with contemporary ecological problems or issues, focusing more on mitigation kind of strategies. And new materialism, I kind of see, tries to focuses more on the adaptation kind of scheme or initiative. We can talk about this later in Q&A. I want to say something, but I can't remember. Ulrich Beck, a German sociologist, has warned us a long time ago in his book, Risk Society. He argued that new scientific development, new technological development will always be followed by new risks. So we shouldn't focus more on building technology. He kind of argues that. Okay, I continue. New materialism, therefore, proposes a more concrete solution to this issue. Recently, scholars like Neera Singh of the University of Toronto, James Smith of the University of York, and Eric Swingedo of the University of Manchester have tried to combine both cultural, theoretical, and a practical legal dimension in new materialism conservation. They invite us to consider the agency and the ability of non-human entities in conservation practice, to amplify the power of these entities to shape the future of our socio-environmental realm, and also to provide a legal basis for this new conservation practice. In acknowledging the interest of non-human entities, these scholars invite us to inject a new materialist perspective into legal arguments. These scholars, I repeat, invite us to inject a new materialist perspective into legal arguments. More importantly, they asked us to envision the possibility of socio-environmental collaboration among various entities: human, non-humans, animates, and inanimates. Although they are well aware of how important the legal aspects of non-human involvement are, they see this involvement as a means of creating a new democratic system. This doesn't mean that creating a new democratic system by advocating for non-human actors will replace human rights advocacy. I argue that advocating for non-human entities will also advocate for greater equity and justice for humans who are suffering from injustices. Acknowledging the legal rights of non-humans will lead to more attention paid to underrepresented groups who have been neglected and excluded in the decision-making process. For example, in the case of Te Urewera and Whanganui River in New Zealand, granting legal rights to these entities, these rivers and lands, have in turn created more opportunities for local stakeholders, the Maori especially, to get involved in managing and protecting natural resources in both areas. They call this initiative co-governance or co-management, where government bodies collaborate with local stakeholders in the daily management of the Te Urewera and Whanganui rivers. So previous to before they, the crown, the representation of British government or the government of New Zealand fully manage the natural resources, especially the Te Urewera, and Whanganui rivers. But after they grant legal rights to these non-human entities, they change the system or mechanism. So right now they work collaboratively with local stakeholders too. So local stakeholders right now are playing more important role in the making of or in managing natural resources in that country. New materialism is therefore advocating that all entities, human and non-human, are allowed to participate in the making of a future society. New materialism also complements previous perspectives such as biocentrism, ecocentrism, indigenous ecology, spiritual ecology, political ecology, and recently integral ecology. The main contribution new materialism aims to make is to employ theory and practice to propose a more democratic conservation practice. Therefore, to conclude, new materialism invites us to combine theory and practice to build future democratic conservation through first, challenging our anthropocentric neoliberal perspective that often devalues the existence of non-human entities. Second, we should broaden our horizons to see the active involvement of non-human entities and the underrepresented local groups or communities in our socio-environmental world. Third, we must acknowledge the legal status of non-human entities. Fourth, we should, as a society, acknowledge that the legal rights of certain non-human entities, such as rivers and forests, among others, are crucial in shaping our future socio-environmental conditions. Although some progressive people in Toledo fail to acknowledge the rights of Lake Erie, and some grassroots communities in India fail to acknowledge the rights of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India, they have not convinced enough people about the agency of these rivers, their interests and subjectivities. But I don't think that failure, if you will, should stop efforts in other places, including here in the US, to build these democratic conservation practice. But to be successful, again, these efforts need strong theoretical foundation and practical strategy. We see the possibility of implementing this new materialist conservation in New Zealand and Ecuador. So my question for all of us, for our discussion, should we try to start a campaign to acknowledge the rights of Spoken River? I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much, Dr. Henning. I offer Mike back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Amri. That's a great place to end off. As a suggestion for how to lead our discussion today, I think it would be useful if maybe we stopped sharing for a second and then people can see pictures. Those of you who feel comfortable and feel like it could turn your video on if you feel like it, use the participant window. If you go to participants at the bottom, click on that, and then you could use the raise hand feature. That'll create a queue. And then I'd encourage us to focus on student questions first. So I'd love to give the students a chance to ask questions. And as you are deciding whether or not you want to raise your hand and formulate a question, I will note on that point that you just made, Dr. Amri, that in 2011 and 2012, there were ballot initiatives in Spokane that would have given rights to the Spokane River. And so this would be actually returning to or bringing back a project that was here almost a decade ago, interestingly. So questions from students first, if there are any. If you don't feel like unmuting yourself, you could also type something into the chat if you would prefer to do that. This is where we wait them out. I know there's some good questions out there. A bunch of my environmental ethics students are out there. They're just formulating a question. We've already talked about Christopher Stone and the rights of nature.
Oh, okay. Wow.
They're gonna have a question for you. I just know it. Otherwise, I'm just gonna have to start calling them people, and all of a sudden, they'll start disappearing.
I see some students of mine too.
So you can call on them. They're your students. Any questions about Dr. Amri's presentation?
I hope this makes sense, guys. So.
All right, so I guess I've got a question. I'm not quite sure how to word it though, but I guess I was just kind of wondering if we're doing anything locally that resembles what you're talking about here as far as acknowledging nature as its own entity or having its own agency, because I guess this is actually something I've kind of thought before, and I didn't realize this was something being talked about at all. So that's very exciting to me, actually. So I'd really like to see this implemented more locally. So do you know of anything locally that's kind of, you know, utilizes these ideals and tries to implement them into any sort of initiative?
I'm a new person in this area, so I should learn more from, I think, my colleagues like Dr. Brian Henning. I'm just bringing this idea, provoke some folks to. Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead and fill in the theoretical part at least, right?
Yeah, I just bring these theoretical because sometimes we couldn't really provide like theoretical foundation of the argument that we are gonna make to promote or advocate something. So by bringing these kind of theoretical foundation, I believe will bring some helps or power, if you will, to the movement. That's what I'm thinking.
There was a group called Envision Spokane that was working in 2011, 2012 on this ballot initiative. The language I just was able to pull up from my old files. This was one of the aspects of what was on the ballot in Spokane in 2012. This was the second part of what they called a Community Bill of Rights, which would have recognized the rights of the river and also of citizens' rights to it. And it almost passed the second time. Interestingly, it failed miserably the first time, but it almost passed the second time. And then the group that was sponsoring it stopped organizing. And I posted in the chat. I believe that Envision Spokane was related to CDELF, the group in the chat there that is one of the international organizations advancing this work. And so there are still organizers locally, although I don't know of any active project. The people who sponsored that in 2012 are still around. So and I could connect you with them if you're interested in talking to them.
So
yeah,
what does, go for it.
Sorry, I was just saying, yeah, I'd be interested in maybe connecting with that group and seeing what I could do to get on board. Thank you.
Cool, Holly. Yep.
So Cole asked a question in the chat. Let's not lose track of that.
Oh. Yeah, from Cole, will humanities continue to advance into a more virtual online era, help or hurt the societal acknowledgement of nature's agency as more and more parts of human lives are digitized? Is this a good step forward in a positive relationship with nature in this way? Yeah, it's really interesting question. I think I should play, we should watch in class. This is for my student, college my student. We're gonna watch Jeremy Rifkin's talk on digital economy later someday in class this semester. He is arguing that digital economy, by using digital technologies, help us to reduce our destructive kind of effects on nature or the environment, by moving forward to focus more on creating jobs in the digital economic world. We help save nature. We reduce our carbon footprints, carbon emissions, so on and so forth. But there is also a small problem with this kind of transition, I should say, in critiquing Jeremy Rifkin's idea, because it is not, zero carbon project. Maybe it is net zero carbon project, but I don't think it's, again, zero carbon project, because even by clicking or searching certain sites, we still emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I can't remember exactly the numbers, but it is somewhere between 0.2 grams to 0.7 grams of carbon emission we created after we click or search something on the internet. And yeah, I hope that makes sense. And at the same time, there are some, causes too. I see from virtual environment, from websites, from the internet, that help us to get involved in contemporary environmental movements. For instance, if you use Ecology instead of using Google or Bing or other, search engines, you contribute to plant more trees, like once or every 45 searches equal to one tree planted somewhere in the world. So they have this kind of interesting project that connect our virtual experience with our physical environment. So but I'm still optimistic to see how it goes in the future. Yeah, thanks, Cole.
Maddie Hines, I think it was, that had a question as well. Do you still have a question, Maddie?
Yeah, I was just wondering what giving rights is going to mean, like legislative wise, and what that's going to give different environmental actions. I don't know how to phrase it different, but yeah.
Oh, say that again, sorry.
Like, what does giving rights actually mean? What powers are different? Yeah.
Yeah, giving rights means that not give, actually. This is a very deep theoretical question. I think we should not give rights or grant rights, actually. We just acknowledge their rights is already there. Their power is already there. Their agency is already there. We just need to, I think, reconceptualize or revitalize our relationship with the non-humans, like nature, rivers, forests, lakes, oceans, so on and so forth. By acknowledging instead of giving rights, we see that they are more powerful, meaningful, and they have more, capacities, agencies to collaborate with us in creating our socio-environmental world now and the future. And this is the main thing that new materialism, I think, try to promote, to build a more collaborative project between us and the non-humans to create a more, better, if you will, socio-environmental world in the future. So I hope that answers your questions. Instead of giving rights, I argue that we should acknowledge their rights. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I'm just wondering, like, does acknowledging their rights just mean they're going to be protected, or what kind of things come about acknowledging those rights?
Yeah, that is a good question. Again, we can also relate these kind of discussion with what people in New Zealand are doing right now with their Wanganui River and Te Urewera Park. The arguments, some of critiques are saying that, oh wow, so they have the non-humans have their rights now, right? We acknowledge them, and how they act. How can we see it, right? This is an interesting critique, but I will say that the way we see their activity, agencies, are not often directly similar to what human beings are doing, their activities. And then new materialism, I will say, will try to bring indigenous perspective back. Instead of rationalizing the active involvement of the non-human entities, we should instead use our affective capacity. And this is really important teaching from Plato, I should say. He is saying that we human beings, we should also activate our affective capacity, emotion, feeling, not only our reasoning, rational capacity. So by using our kind of affective capacity tool or technology, if you will, we can see how they also play some kind of roles in managing natural resources. And like I mentioned before, new materialism try to reincarnate indigenous ecology. In indigenous perspectives, I work with some communities in Indonesia back. Sometimes we talk about the ancestors, the active role of the river in sending messages, so on and so forth. If we only use our rational capacity, we cannot make these sense. We cannot see these as something intelligible, but we use their perspective. And this is what anthropology and new materialism teaches us too, by using emic perspective instead of ethic perspective. Ethic means perspective of the outsiders, and emic means perspective of the insiders, the local community. We can see how those kind of non-human entities play active role too. So nothing is going to left behind. Even nature, Mother Nature can also join or participate in these democratic conservation practices. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Cool.
So, Dr. Amri, you had a request for if you have the link to information about the carbon footprint of using the internet. If you had something you could post in the chat, then they were interested in following up on that. If you have it available for where that footprint data came from, and then Father Clancy has a question there in the chat that everybody can read that goes back to your reference to Bruno Latour.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Father Tim. Oh, I should read it now. Bruno Latour has arrived at this alternative ecology through his work in the philosophy of technology. We draw on smart devices and social robotics as companions more than objects. The smartphones are also referred to as personal assistants. Oh, yeah. Oh, this is interesting. Is this merely a metaphor? This way of thinking can then extend this treatment of technologies as others rather than objects, not only other life forms, but also features of environment, seeing the spoken rivers as our companions acting in networks. Yeah, I didn't really talk about this. I just, critique the technology after reading Ulrich Beck's work. But anyway, I tried to respond to your question. Yeah, technology are also actors. They are powerful actors too in these ecology, in this socio-environmental world. And we kind of are dependent on these technologies too, and sometimes we treat them as our allies, like soulmate. Every morning, we don't really, you know, when I was a kid, the first time I did was went to the kitchen, get a glass of water, and then drink. But right now, as an adult living in this modern world, the first thing I touch is my phone in the morning to see some updates. Sometimes I feel like they are much more important than family members, which is wrong.
Well, we talk about caring for tools. We talk about abusing tools. These are alterity terms. These are personal relationship terms, care and abuse, right?
Right.
So there are respects in which we already treat technologies or tools more like others than like objects. And that was, and this is an answer to a question that was raised earlier, is what is the internet and digital technologies? Is that going to distance us further from nature, or is it going to bring us closer to nature? And I'm arguing that for some of us, like Latour and myself, we came to new materialism through philosophy of technology. It's artificial intelligence that raises the question of, well, maybe these aren't just passive objects that I'm dealing with, because I can't predict their behavior.
Right, yeah.